Okay. Good evening, everyone, to this really wonderful occasion. A sad occasion, obviously, because we remember it was 3 years ago that Neville died, and that we all still miss him quite intensely. But for us, it's also a very special occasion that we can meet in the Neville Alexander Building. It's a real something very special for the University of Cape Town. So my job is a very simple and straightforward job. It's really to guide you through the program and to introduce our speakers who are going to be part of this official renaming occasion of the Neville Alexander Building. So I'm going to call firstly on our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Max Price, to officially and formally welcome you and to make some remarks about why this renaming of the building is so significant for the University of Cape Town. Thanks you.
Thank you, Russell. It's wonderful to see so many friends of Neville, family, and friends of UCT here this evening. A special welcome to Karen Press and the Alexander family, to Prof. Mandla Makhanya. Actually, I didn't see him myself. Is Mandla here? From UNISA. Prof. Zubaydah Desai from the Dean of the Faculty of Education at UWC. Members of the University of Cape Town's Senior Leadership Group, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Deans of Faculties, Registrar and Registrar Designate, and colleagues and friends and students. Today, 3 years, or yesterday, was the 3rd anniversary of Neville's passing. And in the 3 years since he's died, there have been many celebrations of his life. We have celebrated him as an activist, as a scholar, as someone committed to nation building, and particularly committed to how language plays a role in nation building, to education, and particularly basic education, and to a purity of soul, an integrity, a commitment to a socialist ideology and lifestyle which remained with him throughout his life. And as someone who remains a role model as a political activist, when many of our other role models have turned out to be built on plinths of clay. And so it was not surprising that when we came to thinking about how we would like to name and rename some of our buildings, that his name should have been nominated and supported far and wide across the university. And I'm going to leave it to the Dean of Humanities to talk a little bit more about that process. But tonight marks the renaming of this building as the Neville Alexander Building. And we're really proud as a university, both that Neville was so much part of this university, and also that we're able to honor him in this way, in this permanent way. So I'd like to take a few minutes just to talk about his life and how it was intertwined with the university. And I want to say special thanks to Shamil Jappi, who published an article in the Argus last night, an op-ed piece, and this is drawn very largely from that because it really captured all the things that I thought needed to be said. In 1953, a young man from the Eastern Cape entered the University of Cape Town. He was one of a tiny minority of people of color to register at the university that year. Furthermore, he was not from a traditionally English-speaking background, but this did not distract the young Neville Alexander from focusing and excelling at his studies. He majored in German language and literature, history, and English was also amongst his subjects. He was disciplined about his studies, but he spent his free time in the small radical groupings of the Cape Peninsula, and especially was involved in political education. That, of course, happened largely outside of the university's precincts. And in spite of that, his talent as a student and his commitment meant that within a relatively short time, 5 to 6 years, he completed his BA and his MA in German. And after that, he was awarded a prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung grant to study for a doctorate in German literature, which he did at the University of Tübingen, and he wrote a thesis on an aspect of modern German drama. While in Germany, Neville was exposed to another set of debates, because this, of course, was the period, the late 50s and early 60s, when Africa was decolonizing. The first countries, Ghana, followed by many others, were achieving their independence. Many of the young political leaders had links or had studied in Germany. And so he was exposed to these debates in the terminal years of the anti-colonial struggles, where European universities often had these students amongst them, and they would talk and compare notes about the anti-colonial struggles, and involved with issues from migrant workers to issues of nation building, to issues of socialism and African socialism, and he was at the heart of those discussions. And so when he came back to South Africa, he taught German, both at the UCT's Hidding campus and also at Livingston High School, but a lot of his activities, his political activities, were outside of the schools, and after not very long, he found himself volunteering his teaching abilities at the University of Robben Island, where he volunteered for some 10 years between 1964 and 1974, but ever the activist and ever the academic. After his release from Robben Island, he became involved in various educational initiatives in the Cape Town branch of SACED, the South African Council on Higher Education, which was an educational initiative for post-high school students, an alternative education initiative, and an initiative which also assisted many of those students to get into university. He published, just around this time, the book One Azania, One Nation, under a pseudonym, 5 years after his release from Robben Island, and it's an exploration of the national question in South Africa. The basis of the book, its purpose and its tone, was the result of his debates in prison with leading figures in the liberation movement on the national question. He remained unconvinced and indeed was deeply disturbed by the policies and perspectives of all the leading movements in the country on this fundamental issue. Nation building became a central theme of his work, and he would later argue that in the first instance it should entail creating conditions for all South African languages to flourish equally. The choice should not be either English or Afrikaans in a free South Africa. African languages should be given equal recognition and opportunities for development. This was crucial to the ongoing construction of a nation. And this was not a nativist fantasy or fancy, but integral to his vision of a socialist future for the country, which he demonstrated by his political commitment and his lifestyle. His views were also premised on the idea that race has no biological validity, and that radical politics has to begin from an anti-race and anti-racist position. In his last years, this was the source of his critique of the use of race in, for example, the university's admissions policy. And one of the significant and last contributions he made while at UCT before he died was as a member of the commission appointed by council to review the admissions policy, which produced the policy that will be implemented and is currently being implemented for the first cohort to be admitted in 2016. Throughout the 1980s, he increasingly began to work on issues at the intersection of language and politics, to study the language question and to practically address the challenges involved in what is effectively a struggle for multilingualism. He brought to UCT a major project called PRISA, the Project for the Study of Alternative Education in South Africa, a project which he brought here in 1992 and which left us just a year ago because it has been so successful in what it's done, and through that in generating the kinds of funds that really make it an independent and strong NGO, which does not need the shell or the home of UCT to be successful. It is momentous that the Humanities Building, which houses among other departments the School of Education, the Institute for the Humanities in Africa, is being renamed in his honor. He was a speaker at one of the panels at the inauguration of HUMA in 2010, and a good deal of Neville Alexander's thinking was about education. I'd like to offer a quote from his writings relating to this issue of education. He said, a radically new educational culture will only eventuate if we begin to restructure the foundations of the educational system. This means that we have to pay attention in detail to the two crucial areas of basic education, preschool and primary schooling, and teacher training. Those are the two crucial areas. And these are certainly the two areas that receive a lot of attention from our School of Education in this building. An activist all his life, he was also a scholar and never saw a contradiction in straddling those two spheres. He authored 8 books and hundreds of research papers. The last book was published posthumously the title is Thoughts on a New South Africa by Jacana in 2012. The African Studies Library at UCT was made a custodian of the papers of Neville Alexander. It is a major collection of personal and political materials, of papers and books, published and unpublished, of photographs and audiovisual materials. All in all, some 240 archival boxes have been given over to the library, to the African Studies Library, taking a space of about 2 cubic meters, and part of one of our projects is to digitize these papers so that they can be easily accessible to people all over the world. He passed away on August the 27th, 2012. The decision to rename the building was taken in 2014, and it's a fitting memorial by the university to this great alumnus. His intellectual focus on the role of language in the creation of the new society was a deeply humanistic endeavor. The study of languages has been amongst the historic pillars of humanistic learning. A scholarly space in his honor also holds the hope that the intellectual life of this building will continue his legacy of intellectual curiosity and critique, and especially of anti-racism and social justice. So it's really my great pleasure again to welcome you all, and I don't know if we have a ribbon at some point, but to formally say that we rename the building as the Neville Alexander Building.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. I'm now going to call on the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Sakela Bushunga, to speak about the significance of this building for the Faculty of Humanities.
Thank you, thank you very much, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight to grace this occasion. For us as a Faculty of Humanities, it's a great honor to host or co-host with the Vice Chancellor this event. It's very significant for us for reasons that I'll outline just now. It's very, very seldom that renaming of university buildings are accompanied by a ceremony. It certainly is the first one for me in all my time at university. I always wake up and see a new sign up on a building, but that's the first significance about this occasion, that we thought it fit to kind of organize, bring together friends, family, colleagues, and fellow activists and members of the university community to come and once again kind of grace this occasion and remember Dr. Neville Alexander. We are, and I am particularly honored that this ceremony is held to lend the name of this intellectual, this activist, to a building occupied by us, our Faculty of Humanities. It's quite proper and fitting that it is humanities faculty that is doing this. I just want to, just in case people walk away, I mean, people will be asking this question, what was the name before? And what was the name before? Is this an instance of historical erasure once again, where we remove, displace one person and put another. I just want to kind of clarify this because this is very, very important. The 2001 UCT Register of Buildings had an entry for building number 106. Building 106, being this one, said, the entry was quite brief. It said, Humanities Graduate School Building. This is an interim name. This is an interim name. And then 2 years later, not 2 years later, rather 12 years later, the 2013 register had the building under a different number, 01060. And the entry, once again, read, this time, note the difference, Humanities Building, an interim name. So the first one was Humanities Graduate School Building. This one is Humanities Building. So something happened in that 12-year period. I don't know what it was. Of course, this latter entry was after a council decision, a resolution in 2012, to name the structure the Humanities Building for an interim period. Note this, for an interim period until a suitable name had been identified. Until an interim name. So here's a building that's been waiting for a name. And so there was no name. Nobody, there's no story to tell about somebody who was displaced. This is a building that's been waiting for a name. Clearly then, this building, situated at the southern kind of end of the avenue, University Avenue, was not as fortunate as the rest of its cousins in the university. It didn't have a name. But the misfortune of the building didn't end there. The building also changed occupants several times. What is not clear in the records of the university is it's not clear why this name was deemed interim, Humanities Building, Humanities Graduate School Building. It's also not clear why it was so difficult to find a name. What we do know is that the building was built sometime in the 1960s, and the first occupants, significantly, I mean, the Vice Chancellor has mentioned connections between Dr. Alexander and education. This building was first occupied by the faculty, the then Faculty of Education, the 1960s. Of course, the documents and records do not explain what the original name was. I looked for it, I couldn't find one in the records. But what is important to say is that this building has been home to several faculties, at least two. First, Faculty of Education. Again, the reasons are quite very sketchy, or the facts are rather sketchy. The Faculty of Law was accommodated here at some point. And other departments, various other departments were here. And of course, today, it is home once again to the School of Education. Note the difference, not the Faculty of Education, the School of Education. It is also home to the Department of Philosophy. It is home to humor, and it is home to the school's development unit. Those are the kind of occupants. All of them are under the Faculty of Humanities. Now, the combination of those departments speak to the work of Dr. Alexander in various ways. Education, philosophy, the school's development unit, which is doing a lot of kind of very important outreach work for the university and for the faculty. And of course, humor, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. So all of those, once again, are kind of occupants of the building that have connections directly or indirectly to the work of Dr. Alexander. Now, let me just outline the process again, because this is important. The process was quite the renamed building is surprisingly, I am a member of the committee, the names of since last year. I was surprised, pleasantly so, by the simplicity of the process of renaming of buildings. I think it's important for me to outline this very briefly. The process preceded the events, the heady events of the first half of 2015 by several months. A proposal came before the committee, and the proposal is simply this: about 2 pages, 3 pages of a motivation, and whatever number of pages it takes to kind of present the CV of the person. And it was discussed by the committee last year in August. The committee, if I may say so, I do know I'm not speaking out of turn, the committee was unanimous in its support for the new name. It was absolutely uncontroversial. The proposal was, the recommendation was then sent forth to council, and council, I wasn't there, but council endorsed the recommendation fully. It's therefore a case of a renaming that was long overdue, building that had been sitting without a name, and therefore it is a pleasure for us that what we're not doing here, we're not doing some kind of social engineering in terms of names. We're finding a building that was looking for a name, and the timing was absolutely perfect for us. And it is therefore a pleasure for us to say and to thank the family of Dr. Alexander to allow us to use his name or to lend his name to this building. And that's a very, very important one. Now, let me just say a few things before I identify some of the people who are part of these processes. Dr. Alexander was a scholar, was an activist. He was involved in debates, in dialogue, all his life on issues of public concern. And we're hoping, I hope that this space, and I know our colleagues work from this building, they teach in this building, especially this time of day. There's always kind of activities here in the School of Education. The colleagues are here, they know this, but I hope that this space also becomes that space for those robust debates, for dialogue, by not only students and staff in the Faculty of Humanities, but in the entire university. It's a space where people can meet, they can dialogue, they can disagree about education, about society, about the world. Just to thank several people, just to, again, as a measure of the significance that we attach to this event, this occasion, several parts of the university kind of came together in various ways. I just want to identify them to make the point. First of all, the names of buildings committee, I will not name all of them, but there are 2 members who are involved very closely with these processes, planning and conceptualizing today. And that is Professor Deborah Posel and Dr. Manda Mlauzi. Both of them are here. I would also like to acknowledge the support by the Registrar's Office and support and advice on various issues to do with naming of buildings, especially facilitation with obtaining permission by the family and so on. I would like to acknowledge the libraries, university libraries, Gwenda Thomas for her involvement in the process, and Renata. And Renata has done an excellent job in kind of organizing and curating what we've seen here on this side of the wall. But she's part of a bigger project, the digitization project by the libraries, hosting, organizing, and taking custodianship of the work of Dr. Alexander. The DVC's office, I need to underline the DVC's office, I need to loudly acknowledge the contribution of the DVC's office, Professor Crane Sudin and Professor Anwar Mall for their support. They did give, Anwar said I should mention the amount, but I think it might be read very, I will not name the amount, Anwar, but thank you very much for the support. The The Development and Alumni Department, Dr. Russell Ali has been part of this from the start, working with us, and Elle for participating with in organizing the logistics. In humor, Shamil was very important, not only for the piece that he wrote, but for ideas, for participating in some of the discussions. But I need to mention at this point that on Saturday, tomorrow, there's another event that Shamil is central in organizing, again, in honor of the memory of Dr. Alexander. And that one is kind of targeted at a student constituency and members from the outside. So thank you very much for that. The Center for African Studies, Professor Lungisile Nsebeza, has been part of this, again, part of also kind of liaising with the committee and kind of advising on sensitivities around issues of this nature. Again, the Center for African Studies had an event last night, a very well attended event last night on the legacy of Dr. Alexander with reference to language. Very vibrant, animated debates about those issues last night. Finally, I would like to thank Libo from the Dean's Office. Libo, you would have received a correspondence, some of you, from Libo. She doesn't like to be acknowledged, but she has been kind of very centrally involved in organizing this. And once again, thank you very much, everyone. And we are very delighted to be running ahead of those calls to kind of address issues of symbolism, not because we're being pushed or swept along by the wave, but we're leading the wave. I just need to say one last thing, which is related here. I need to say it last because it's not. When the proposal for Dr. Alexander's name to be used to rename this building was made, coincidentally, another building was also up for renaming. And it's further down the avenue this way. It's also our building, Humanities. For many of you who know UCT well, it used to be called the Arts Block. Again, another neutral name. And the proposal was to rename it the A.C. Jordan Building. So if you walk around the avenue now, please don't get lost. The A.C. Jordan Building is the old Arts Block. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dean. And now it gives me much pleasure to invite Lydia Cairncross, Dr. Lydia Cairncross, to come and speak to us about Neville and Neville's ideas, Neville's legacy. Lydia is attached to the University of Cape Town through her association as a surgeon, or association with Groote where she is a surgeon. Sure that she doesn't need much introduction to many of you. You will know that she has always been a very close associate of Neville, who played a very significant role in her own development, in her own political development. So I would imagine that she sees him as a mentor of sorts. The Vice Chancellor and I met Lydia for the first time this evening, and we were sort of just chatting, and he was quite taken by the fact when she mentioned to him that she had joined WASA at the age of 14 already. So I think she's a very appropriate person to come and speak to us about Neville Alexander and his legacy. Lydia?
Thank you, Russell. And thank you to everybody present here tonight, in particular to members of Neville's family and to Karen and to the university for giving me this opportunity to speak about Neville Alexander, who I suppose I can summarize in saying that Neville was my leader, though he would hate for us to say that. It's an interesting alignment of events for me, because it's not often that I make a political input in a place where I play my professional role. And if all has gone according to plan, my 3-year-old daughter should be somewhere in the audience. So it's the bringing together of the political, the professional, and the personal all in one evening. I've entitled my input Neville Alexander Towards One Azania, One Nation. Neville Alexander was a theoretician, an academic, a writer, and a teacher. But also, and this will be the focus of my input, a socialist and a revolutionary. A revolutionary in the sense of both engaging with the world we live in and, more importantly, trying to change it. The last time I saw Neville was about a week before he died. It was a few days after the Marikana massacre, which still looms large on our political landscape. He was already very ill and found it difficult to talk for a long period of time, but even then remained interested in understanding this event, what it may mean for South Africa, Azania, and how significant it may be in changing our reality and our world. And Neville certainly tried to change the world. From the time of his early youth, when he left Cradock, the town of his birth, and moved to Cape Town to study at UCT, by building and leading a variety of organizations, and I will mention them, from the Teachers League of South Africa, the Society of Young Africa, SOYA, the Cape Peninsula Students' Union, the Non-European Unity Movement, the Uchi Chan Club, the National Liberation Front, the South African College for Higher Education, SACED, Kanya College, the Cape Action League, the National Forum, the Workers' Organization for Socialist Action, the Workers' List Party, the Project for Alternative Education in South Africa, PRISA, the Langa Youth Reading Group, and the Truth Movement. He tried to change the world in many ways, by analyzing, by reading, and by writing, by being a key theoretician in important national and international political meetings, and by engaging in guerrilla warfare, but also by sitting through endless campaign meetings to plan the minutiae of transport, food, agendas, minutes for conferences, by interacting with conservative and myopic government bureaucrats trying to change policy, by helping to paint placards and banners for demonstrations, yes, really, painting, by reading to young children on a Saturday morning, by patiently and sometimes not so patiently listening to the circular arguments of comrades and friends, and knowing that this too was part of the struggle. And it's this person of integrated socialist theory and action that I would like us to remember today. As mentioned before, I met Neville when I joined the Workers' Organization for Socialist Action in 1990, so now you can do the maths and figure out my age. Neville was its first chairperson, and from that time until his death in 2012, Neville was, for myself and for many others in this room, a key leader of the socialist movement, both in this country and internationally. One of my earliest memories of Neville is going on a door-to-door campaign in Elsies River. We were collecting 10,000 signatures that we required to participate in the 1994 elections. Side by side with many others, I have sat with Neville through countless meetings, planning meetings, boring meetings, inspiring meetings, Sunday cook sister meetings. We've distributed many pamphlets, painted many banners, and had many arguments. So I did not know him as a university academic, but rather as a political activist, as someone who was experimenting with implementing social change now and talked about making revolution soon. So on socialism, when I say that Neville was a socialist, I don't mean that he was a social democrat or a liberal educationist, but a socialist who believed in the fundamental and radical transformation of society, believing that this transformation was essential to ensure, and I quote, that every child and human being has more than an outside chance of fulfilling their full human potential, end quote. Now, idealists and socialists are somewhat unpopular and hard to come by these days. As a society, we have become immune to the depth of suffering and deprivation which surrounds our beautiful cities, inoculated from a young age to ignore the injustice of this wealthy nation that cannot feed and house its own people, where rampant consumerism and individualistic capitalism is the norm. For many, the violent brutality that holds together this impossible mix of wealth and poverty is only seen when acts of crime are committed and spill into the quiet, leafy suburbs of the areas that many of us inhabit. So to believe in a socialist, just, and equal world today seems rather otherworldly. But Neville said in his essay, No God Hypothesis Required, in 1996, if you can believe in heaven and other notions of life of a perfect harmony after death, it ought not to be too difficult to conceive of the possibility of a raceless and classless society here on earth. At the same time, Neville would often couch the core of his socialist philosophy in the simplest biblical terms, quoting his great friend and renowned socialist Ernest Mandel. And I quote, "The most urgent need in our country today is the need to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to house the homeless, and care for the sick." I've also mentioned revolution and revolutionary, and I think that's important because one of the defining features of the left movement to which Neville was a part and which informed all his work, whether linguistic or educational, was that we do not see a gradual transition from the current system of capitalism to a new social, political, and economic order. After completing his PhD in Germany, Neville returned to South Africa and was profoundly affected by the Sharpeville massacre, which took place shortly thereafterwards. And I quote, "From the Defiance campaign to Sharpeville to Soweto, a red line of blood and suffering gave continuity to our struggle through its many valleys and over its few but memorable peaks." End quote. And he understood that the apartheid South African state could not be transformed or defeated without armed struggle. And he therefore began building a guerrilla warfare movement called the UCT Chan Club, and subsequently the National Liberation Front. As a result of this and other activities, Neville was imprisoned on Robben Island from 1964 to 1974. In 2010, Neville was invited to give the Srini Moodley lecture at UKZN, and it was entitled South Africa, the Unfinished Revolution. And here Neville speaks to the fact that there are very few thinking South Africans who are not shocked and concerned about what is happening in our country. And I quote, that most South Africans, certainly most oppressed and exploited South Africans, feel that they have been, if not betrayed, then certainly misled since 1994. End quote. And we know this. We know we live in a South Africa with a widening gap between rich and poor, a nation where our education system cannot teach our children to read, write, and add, where quality healthcare is primarily the prerogative of the rich, and the painful continuities of privilege and skin color continue and are inescapable. So yes, we have the vote, but the other dreams of a bright new nation seen so clearly in the heady days of 1994 have been stillborn. The negotiated settlement, drafted in the secret backrooms and corridors of CODESA from 1990 to 93, while the rest of the country was ravaged by political violence, ensured only that the economic and social fabric of the capitalist South Africa would remain unchanged. A political revolution only, an isolated changing of the guard, has been orchestrated, simultaneously raising and dashing the hopes of millions. Of course, Neville was aware of the terribly uncomfortable position many well-meaning and genuine ANC leaders find themselves in and found themselves in then. And I quote, "Today there are few people in the leadership of the ANC who do not realize that taking office is not the same thing as taking power. When they complain, as they often do, that they have been stymied and betrayed by the bureaucracy which they have inherited from the apartheid state, they, in their own naive way, merely confirm the continuity of the capitalist state in South Africa. Whether or not it is fashionable to quote the founders of the modern socialist movement, there is no doubt that the view put forward by men and women such as Marx, Engels, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg and others that a revolution is required to smash the machinery of the old state and reconstruct the society in the interest of the new has been completely vindicated in the case of the new South Africa. He then goes on to say that the final disillusionment will come, of course, when the repressive apparatuses of the state, instead of supporting the exploited classes and other oppressed strata, turn their weapons on the masses to protect the interests of the capitalist class. This chillingly accurate prediction saw the light of day on the 16th of August 2012 in the events that unfolded on a small but now infamous kopje called Marikana. On race and racism. Neville Alexander was known for his bold and uncompromising stance on race and racism. As far back as 1979, when most liberation movements and most of the scientific community still took the existence of race as axiomatic, in One Azania, One Nation, he writes, "To speak of the irrelevance of race still assumes the reality of race as a biological entity. It is necessary to stress that in my position, and backed by a growing scientific tradition, the interpretation of non-racial means the denial of the reality of race." End quote. So for me, one of the most diabolical features of the new South Africa is how the categories created by Verwoerd 65 years ago and others over the past 400 years have been embraced and promoted unchallenged as appropriate forms of social dialogue and scientific study. That this new country, born out of centuries of violent racial oppression, makes no attempt to build an anti-racism movement based on the premise that we belong to one race, the human race. This is a sad testimony to the fact that societies very seldom learn from their own history. The ongoing requirement at all levels of government bureaucracy for people to categorize themselves has more than erased the brief period in our struggle where people, supported by liberatory philosophies like Black consciousness, genuinely questioned and opposed and rejected their classification into the four racial groups, Black, colored, Indian, and white, that we see in all our state documents. Today, the ongoing use of these categories is promoted as a way to ensure redress, social redress. But, to quote Neville, fighting race with race is bad social science and even worse practical politics. End quote. Taken on face value, using race to promote redress is extremely short-sighted. But if we look beyond that and look at it more critically, it can be seen as an attempt to disguise the fact that genuine fundamental change has not taken place in this country. While a small layer of the Black middle class may benefit from these policies and serve to make the appearance of corporations more palatable, the fact is that the majority of Black South Africans remain trapped in a poverty cycle, unable to find decent education or work, while the struggle heroes of yesteryear occupy plush boardrooms in the corporate world. With a sleight of hand, the struggle is made to still be about race, where in fact it is about class, finish and klaar, as Neville said in good South African English. For a university such as UCT, the issue of race is critical on many levels. At a social level, it relates to how students on campus are integrated with one another. At a political level, as we know, it is important as it relates to the admissions policies and other attempts at social redress. It can be argued by some that academics and intellectuals are somewhat constrained in what they can do about these two arenas in terms of societal rules and broader issues. But the same cannot be said when it comes to the issue of race in science and race in research. Like an enormous elephant in the room, this issue is pointedly ignored by our academic institutions. The minutiae of every scientific category in research studies is examined for accuracy, reproducibility, measurability, etc. And then race is just thrown in, unquestioned and unchallenged, even when race is not part of the study question. It is added as an almost knee-jerk demographic. The fact that the last scientific objective quantification of black, colored, Indian, and white was done by the Furvidian population census takers with the aid of hair pencils is just not seen, thought about, or discussed. And researchers who may question the use of race are seen as overly sensitive and obstructive. As an institution of higher learning, what contribution can we make to ameliorating the social devastation caused by racial prejudice and race-based thinking? As scientists and academics, we can make clear that while race as a real social construct exists, and while racial prejudice as a powerful social force exists, race as biology does not. That we can no longer use the shorthand of race to describe social class, education status, language group, or any of the other categories that have been used to justify this. The time for this dangerous shorthand is over. Let us do the proper work. If we need to examine the role of diet and economic status on health, let's evaluate that. Let's not evaluate race and its impact on health. If we want to look at the role of language and culture on health-seeking behavior, then let's look at that. Let's not ask, so are you colored or are you Zulu, when we want to do that study. Using race as a lazy social category in our research bolsters it as a rational, justifiable biological category. It's time to stop creating and recreating race-based thinking through our work. This is within our power as academics and as universities, and would be a fitting legacy to the Neville Alexander we are honoring tonight. As we gather here today, renaming this building after Neville, how do we rethink our responsibility as intellectuals, as agents of social change? It's easy to become seeped in pessimism and throw our hands up in despair at the mammoth task of building a new country and indeed a new world. But despite many decades of struggle and many moments of triumph and disaster, brilliance and error of both himself and the political left, Neville showed an unbridled optimism, and in his last book says, I quote, "Let us take a step back and try to get perspective on what has actually happened since 1990, when the new South Africa began. Even more optimistically, I hope that such a rethink will inspire the reader to find a point of engagement with a view to initiating or becoming part of trajectories that lead to that other country most of us had in mind." In his last works, and also in the discourse of the last years of his life, Neville talked about a move to new forms of organization that were more open and responsive, that included music and dance and drama and poetry, and were not only about organized labor, but also education, health, and the environment. And he said, we have to rebuild our communities and our neighborhoods by means of establishing as far as possible on a voluntary basis all manner of community projects. When I read this quote, I remember Neville in his 70s, this giant of an intellectual, sitting and reading to preschool children in Langa at the Vulindlela Reading Club, and then dancing to Brenda Fassie's catchy tune by that same title, Vulindlela, Open the Way. This community project spoke of his tremendous love for children, of music, and of course of reading. So this part is clear. We need to act locally and act now to improve the real material conditions of our people, whether it be volunteering at clinics, running reading groups, building cooperatives, enabling food gardens. There are many different projects. But that is not enough. We also need to look globally at what needs to be changed and how we begin to look at revolutionary change. Perhaps instead of taking Neville's work forward as a frozen in time set of truths, we should rather pose a series of questions and let those answers be the beginning. Questions such as, what do we mean by nation building? What is race, and what is its role in the new South Africa? What is democracy? What is electoral democracy and participatory democracy? How do we hold the state responsible, but also be our own liberators by actually fixing our street lights and cleaning the local park? How do we develop a new value system while oppressed and crushed by the value system of the one we live under? And as we answer these questions, what organizational forms speak to this work? And how can they be places where empathy and humanitarianism flourish? So to end, Jonathan Jansen is quoted as saying that Neville was the last of the true revolutionaries. I hope that in this one instance, he is wrong, and that some of those beautiful ones are not yet born, and yet others live among us. I hope that Neville's name on this building will encourage those who learn within it to live as he did, with courage and integrity, to always ask the difficult questions, and to be so bold as to try to change the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So we have come more or less to the end of the formal proceedings. Many thank yous have already been said. I'm not going to repeat all those thank yous except to again express our deep and heartfelt appreciation to the family of Neville Alexander and his lifelong partner, Karen, for having facilitated the renaming of this building by agreeing that we could use Neville Alexander's name, which could not have been easy, because those of you who know Neville, who knew Neville, I was fortunate as a young student in Cape Town then to meet Neville soon after he came off the island. So those who know Neville would know that this would be something that he would have tremendous difficulty with. I mean, one of his favorite poems, I remember then, was the Bertolt Brecht poem of Questions of a Worker Who Learns to Read, which was precisely about the need not to elevate the individual above the collective. So it couldn't have been an easy decision. But for us, the building actually, we hope, through Neville, represents the collective, the worker who actually learns to read. That this is a way in which the ideas and legacy of Neville Alexander, as opposed to Neville as an individual or cult figure, will endure. That's the significance of the renaming for us, and I think the spirit in which the family and Karen supported the renaming of the building. Those of you, I hope that you will have time to walk around the building, and I hope that you especially will have time to look at the curation on this side of the building of the works of Neville and Neville's history. We've been very fortunate that Neville's work was given to the University of Cape Town, and as the Dean actually mentioned, our libraries have done a fantastic job of cataloging and indexing this work. If you read one of the entries on one of the walls, you'll see that it took 9 months to get it into the shape in which it is in. It's an incredible achievement. It's an extremely accessible catalog. very easy to identify how Neville's thoughts evolved over time and the areas in which he was interested in. So I urge you to really spend some time looking at it. I have an ulterior motive for asking you to do that, and that is that although we have succeeded in cataloging Neville's work, and Neville's work now is accessible for anybody who wants to see it in the library, we want to actually make Neville's work accessible online. So we want to actually digitize Neville's work, and this is part of a broad humanities project. It will not only be Neville's work, but other works as well, but we'll start with Neville's work. And for that, we're going to need a huge injection of funding. And so we actually appeal to those of you who believe that this is something significant, very important for the university to do, to partner with us on it. As a university, we have already made a commitment. We have put resources of the university behind this project, but we need additional resources, not just to digitize and make Neville's work accessible, but also to make the work of others accessible. So, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for those who helped organize this event. And now is an opportunity for us to catch up. So many people have not seen each other for a long time, and also to just look at the curation that the libraries are responsible for. So thanks, everyone.